I'd like to introduce our first keynote. His name is Mario Molina. He is the strategic trainer and leader for Al Gore's Climate Reality Project Leadership Corps. Mario comes from Guatemala. He has a tremendous connection with nature in his life there as a river guide at some point. But his knowledge and understanding of the global perspective of the climate issues is immense because he's immersed in it almost every day with a man that's possessed about solving the problem. And he's just arrived back from Brazil, where they had another leadership corps training. And I'd like to introduce him and have him bring us a global perspective on the climate crisis.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Bob. Thank you so very much. And thanks, everyone, for making it. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. So Bob asked me to basically do a summary of the current global climate crisis and pathways to solutions in 15 minutes. So thanks, Bob. And I guess we might as well go ahead and get started. So as Bob mentioned, my name's, I'm Mario Molina, and I run the Leadership Corps training program for Vice President Gore's Climate Reality Project. And I think we actually have a couple of climate leaders here in the audience, aside from Bob. Can I get a show of hands? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, thanks. Great. So in my role as the director of the program, I have had the privilege of training about 4,000 climate leaders from in Istanbul, Johannesburg, Chicago, most recent Melbourne, and most recently Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. But it's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to address an audience here in Colorado, which has become recently become my home state. Being from Guatemala, I have also had the privilege of traveling and working directly in about 16 different countries throughout this great, beautiful planet that we like to call home. As I said, most recently, I like to call Colorado home. As of a year ago, I am a Colorado resident, and there's nowhere else that I'd rather live. We have a house just up the road between here and Ned and Boulder Canyon, and I love the aspen groves and the pine trees that surround my house. Yet I also have a pretty constant worry of the risk of fire and extreme weather events that we are all susceptible to because of what is becoming the new normal in climate change. My wife and I enjoy the regular activities that we love to practice here in this state: climbing, biking, hiking, etc. And so it's, there's nowhere else that I would really rather call home. There is no more important geography in our minds than that place which we like to call home. Now this is home. This is home for all of us. This image, many of you might know, is called Earthrise. And it was emblematic. It was taken in 1972 from the last Apollo mission, halfway between the Earth and the Moon. And it became emblematic of the environmental movement back in the 1970s. And I think it's emblematic of why we are all here today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the science of climate change. I think that pretty much everyone here in the room understands the basics of greenhouse gases and what carbon pollution is doing to threaten not only the planet that we call home, but the ecosystem services that home provides in order for us to be able to exist as a civilization and for the rest of life to exist on Earth. Carbon pollution is basically the most dangerous and imminent threat to our existence on the planet right now. Now, carbon pollution comes from many different sources and industries, and I'm not going to get into the details of which industry produces more and which industries can be addressed how, etc. But I think that the critical point for us to remember is that none of these industries currently are being held accountable for the cost of the carbon pollution that they are dumping into the atmosphere every day. There is no internalization of that cost and the social cost and ecosystem cost of carbon to our system, to the systems that support us. So global emissions from fossil fuels, and I was just told, oh, so you're the guy that's going to give us the bad news. And I am going to give you some bad news, but I'm also going to give you some good news. But first, let's get a context of the bad news. The bad news is that over the course of the last 30 years, we have tripled, expanded by 300% the amount of fossil fuel carbon pollution going into the atmosphere. We are currently dumping about 900,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent pollution into the atmosphere every year. Concomitant to that, we have 4 different research centers showing us 4 different models that basically tell us that with that increase in carbon pollution, we have also seen over the last 30 years, over that same course of time, a 1 degree average global warming increase across the planet. 30 years, 1 degree. Since the Industrial Revolution, 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees of global warming. I don't have to remind anyone in this room what the impact of 1.5 degrees has been on Colorado. The fires of 2012, we all remember the fires of 2012, last year's floods. We had just moved here when the Boulder floods happened. So everyone here, I think we are well aware of what the impacts are. It's also important, however, to remember that this is not only a local problem. And to Bob's point, it is a global problem. And the global consequences of this problem will have indirect effects in our lives because they threaten U.S. interests overseas as well. Just in May of this year, over 6,000 people were either killed or displaced in the Badakhshan province of northeastern Afghanistan, further destabilizing what I would not consider to be the most stable region in the world right now. So, in addition, we have heard a lot about ISIS, and the rise of ISIS has dominated the news cycle for the last couple of weeks. Politicians on both sides of the aisle have argued about the politics of intervention and what is necessary to be done there. However, no one has really addressed the underlying causes for the destabilization of the region. 2006 to 2010, drought turned 60% of Syria's fertile land into desert. By 2010, the drought had killed 80% of the country's cattle, displacing millions of people and aggravating an already impoverished area of the world. This man, his name is Ahmed Abdullah. He's a 48-year-old farmer who no longer can farm his land. His kids are now displaced. Young, poor, frustrated people in a very poor, unstable region of the world. So already in 2008, we had been forewarned about what the collapse of irrigation systems, fertile systems, and extended drought in Syria would mean for global security. Basically, hell became unleashed, and it's still being unleashed. These are the consequences of what is by many accepted and recognized as a large climate change-induced drought in the region. For the Department of Defense, climate change is an imminent global threat to global security. This is not a political debate anymore. This is not an ethics debate. This is science, and it is an imminent threat. The scientific forecast is for more ice melts. These are just a couple of examples. What's happening in Syria and Afghanistan are just a couple of examples of the destabilization of the global systems upon which our civilization has come to depend. So, yes, I am giving you a lot of bad news. This was basically the context into which we entered 2014. Now, in 2014, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon took a very, very aggressive step and I think showed formidable leadership in convening the UN Climate Summit that some of you might have heard about in September 21st. This is the first step in a process that is meant to last a year on the road to a process that has been that is now known as the Road to Paris. The Road to Paris is basically a series of negotiations that started in September, leading up through Lima next month, and leading up to agreements in March, draft agreements in March, and in 2015, hoping to sign globally binding agreement on limiting carbon emissions worldwide. Now, the key word here is going to be legally binding agreements. All the agreements that we have to date have actually been voluntary. On September 21st, there we go. On September 21st, 400,000 people poured out into the streets of New York City. 400,000 people from over 180 countries. And 2,600 cities worldwide joined in demonstrations, showing that the political will exists for global leaders to take aggressive action on climate change. Now, there are three countries, key countries to the negotiations, that don't actually have carbon policies in place right now. I mean, there's many countries that don't have carbon policies in place, but three key countries that need to have carbon policies in place for this to move forward: Brazil, the US, and China. So we just came back from Brazil. We're hopeful about the progress that Brazil will make towards their commitments. Someone was asking me about the announcement this week about the bilateral deal between President Obama and President Xi from China. It is a step in the right direction. I'm not going to get into it because we don't have the time, but it sends a strong signal to other stakeholders that the world's two biggest polluters are serious about reducing emissions. And it is the right signal for them to send at this time. Here's where it gets interesting for us. And here's where we go back to at least national, if not yet local. And it's this year. How many of you know about the EPA regs that are under commenting period right now? Okay, so about half of the room. We need everyone in this room and everyone outside of this room to know about the EPA regulations. Basically, President Obama has ordered the EPA to set forward rules that would reduce carbon emissions from existing coal-fired power plants by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. This is the only mechanism that the United States has right now to show leadership during the international negotiations. Because especially after last week's elections, no one in the world has any illusion that the United States will actually pass significant climate change legislation in the foreseeable future. And so in order for the US to have a strong negotiating position in Paris, it's imperative that these regulations not only pass, but are seen by the world to be as serious as the new coal-fired plant regulations that were passed last year, which effectively shut down, and this is the good news, which effectively shut down the possibility of any new coal coming online basically in the future. And so the transportation regulations that were passed are also a strong signal. We need for these regulations to be upheld and supported in order for the US to have strong positions. Now, we will hear the same two arguments from interest groups that we have been hearing for years. Number one is, this is going to cost us. It's going to cost the economy. It's going to cost us jobs. It's going to hurt the economy, and it's going to hurt energy security. The other argument is going to be renewable energy is just not affordable without government subsidies. Today, 2014, these two arguments are insane. Why? Because only in the first half of 2014, 56% of new U.S. energy generation came from renewables. We have seen the decline in production of energy from coal. We have seen it decline by 20%. And while natural gas has competed and has grown by 57%, the growth in renewables has been 205%. Renewables are scalable and economically feasible. Existing U.S. wind power capacity at the end of 2013 was 60 gigawatts. For those of us that don't think in gigawatts, megawatts, terawatts, and watts, basically that could power the whole state of California. Onshore wind cost has dropped dramatically from 1984 to 2012. We don't need to get into exactly what these projections are, but basically the line is tall at the beginning, low at the end, good for business. We have seen wind energy farms are propping up all over the United States. Siemens just released an engine that can actually generate 3 megawatts of capacity, which is double what their last big engine could actually generate. We have seen that the number of clean job postings in the United States has climbed by 88% in the last 12 months. Who knows what the national average has been for all jobs? It's been between 8 and 9%, and that's considered good. 88%. Globally, wind could supply worldwide electricity consumption 40 times over. 40 times over. On to solar. The cost of crystalline silicon solar cells has dropped from over $38 per watt back when those big first solar panels came out, down to 78 cents per watt. So the cost of photovoltaics has dropped exponentially. What other technology have we seen that kind of dropping costs from? Computer chips, cellular phones. Basically, when you get this kind of a drop in market costs, markets go from being frozen to fluid. It's the difference of more expensive than, cheaper than. So we have solar arrays, different types of solar arrays throughout the world, from solar panels and photovoltaics to thermoelectric solar plants. The solutions are available. And investment in renewables all around the world is increasing exponentially. That's China. That's China. So when we are talking about the United States becoming competitive on the world market, we have to talk about being competitive on renewables if we don't want to be left behind the curve. From Africa to the Vatican, over 97 countries have now achieved grid parity. It means that electricity from renewables is cheaper than the cost of electricity from fossil fuels. The Vatican has now pledged to be completely fossil fuel free by 2020. They do, however, have 2 market advantages. Number 1, they're a pretty small country. Number 2, they seem to have God on their side. The combination of renewable energies from wind and solar and battery storage, dropping cost of batteries. So the challenge was always intermittency. What happens when the wind's not blowing? What happens when the sun's not shining? Well, now the dropping cost of storage capacity combined make renewables competitive in today's world market. Morgan Stanley has said that energy storage, when combined, could disrupt utilities in the US and Europe to the extent that customers are moving to an off-grid approach. So this is not environmentalists speaking. Morgan Stanley is not well known for its environmental activism. The same thing coming from Barclays. So, a little bit of a switch, because what I want to talk about as well is the carbon bubble. The International Energy Agency has told us that in order to reach a 2-degree maximum limit of global warming, we must keep 2/3 of the current oil and fossil fuel reserves on the ground. That means we can't burn it. If we burn it, we will go way over 4 degrees and 6 degrees Celsius. Now, there's a concept here called, how many of you have heard of stranded assets at this point? Okay, great. So about half of the room. Basically, the big polluters rely on being able to account for burning the unburnable fossil fuel reserves in order to keep their balance sheets high and their stock price high. If we actually put a price on carbon, if we actually say you cannot burn this and make it unaffordable for them to burn those fossil fuel reserves, their stock price collapses. When you're talking about companies like ExxonMobil, which in 2010 showed a 13 billion profit margin, you can see why we are facing the opposition that we are facing. However, it's simple math. I mean, many of you have probably heard Bill McKibben's Connect the Dots math tour. It's simple math. We have to keep the oil in the ground. However, at the UN Paris negotiations, stranded assets won't be the sticking points. The sticking point will actually be reparations. What do we mean by reparations? Reparations is the argument from developing nations, especially the basic bloc, Brazil, Australia, South Africa, India, and China, that the developed world needs to either compensate them for prior emissions or meet its commitment of $100 billion per year into a fund that will go towards mitigation technologies, adaptation technologies, or knowledge and technology transfer. Now, we all know that that is not going to happen. That's not going to happen from the public sector because the developing world does not have that kind of money right now. And so here's the good news. The good news is that where is this money going to come from? Well, what we have seen over the, what we saw in 2012 is that out of $359 billion invested, actually only 38% came from the public sector. The rest of it actually came from the private sector. As the price of these technologies drop, as markets become competitive, this is becoming attractive to investors. And so it is the private sector that will need to help us fill the gap between whatever best agreement we can reach in Paris at COP and the gap that we have to actually meet that 2-degree emissions goal. Warren Buffett is not a man that is known for bad investments. And yet, he is ready to double Berkshire Hathaway's existing $15 billion investment in wind and solar energy. Now, he is moving on this. When Warren Buffett moves, it sends a pretty strong signal to the markets. We can do this. Not only can we do this, we must do this. We can't afford not to do it. And so, thankfully, another piece of good news is that businesses are getting on board. These are just some of the companies that are already using 100% renewable electricity in the US. There are various mechanisms by which we can support those companies. Number one, consumer choices. Obviously, how do we support companies that are actually doing the right thing and let them know that we are behind the choices that they're making? Number two is for those of you that are business owners here, for those of you that are running, institutions here, you can make those same choices. Here in Colorado, there are several companies that are actually selling energy offsets, renewable energy credits, etc. There's several. Colorado is a very strong market for carbon offsets and renewable technologies. Basically, this is the challenge that we have in front of us. In order to meet the 2-degree global warming emission target set forth by the International Energy Agency, we have to decarbonize our economy. What does that mean? It means that we need to separate economic growth from fossil fuels and from carbon pollution emissions. It is possible to do so. We have the technology, we have the political will, we have the people, we have the knowledge. What we need to do is actually get going on it. Because it is going to be a challenge. We have to decarbonize at 6% per year, which is 6 times greater than what we have been able to achieve over the last 10 years. We have been decarbonizing at probably 0.9%, and some of it was actually helped by the economic recession of 2008. So the question that I usually get is, okay, well, this is all fine and dandy in the global scale, in the big scheme of things, but what can we do? What can I do? Well, I think that, number one, you're here today. So that's the first thing that you could do, and thank you for doing it, because that's a great first step. Many of you are already doing other great things. But the collective action, collective power, what we are going to do is we need innovators, policymakers, organizers, business models, idea makers to come together at summits like this and generate ideas for policy, ideas for business, ideas for political action that can be implemented, tested at the local scale, and then scaled globally. Because while this is affecting us in Colorado, and while this is a Colorado summit, what we need to do is we're going to have to innovate and scale in order to meet the 2-degree challenge. So I would say deepen your commitment at a personal level. Stay informed. It is important. It is important to know what our local legislators' approach to climate change and low-carbon solutions is, but it's also important to know what it is that's at play at the national level and at the global scale, because this is going to require a global movement. There are many other organizations represented here, great organizations like Audubon and Western Research Institute. Join an organization that allows you to keep informed and that engages you. Join 5 organizations. We're not protective. Climate Reality Project, please, you can sign on. Remain engaged in the political process, and then invest your time and your resources based on that information and that engagement. Whether you are a multimillionaire or whether you are, a teacher, whether you work like myself in the nonprofit sector, our choices matter. They don't only matter because of the impact that they have with our spending dollars and our votes, but they matter because of the perception of the public of what we are doing and how we are investing our time and resources. Ultimately, let no one tell us that we are going to be able to fly away from this problem or ignore this problem and have it go away. This is our home. As Carl Sagan said, our home is a lonely planet suspended in a sea of stars. Thank you.